Hey there, strategic authorpreneurs. I'm Crystal Hunt.
And I'm Michele Mitrani. We are here to help you save time, money, and energy as you level up your writing career.
Welcome to episode number 4 of the Strategic Authorpreneur podcast. On today's show, we're going to take a deep dive into the editing process. So looking at when and how to hire an editor, how to save yourself money by preparing your manuscript properly. Bet you didn't know there was a proper way, but there is. And talking about the different kinds of editing and what stages a manuscript goes through before it's ready for publication. So tell us, what all do you know about editing?
Okay.
Yeah, dive in. Go for it.
This episode should have been divided in 12 or half a dozen different episodes, because there is so much to say about the editing process, which in my humble opinion, I think is one of the most important thing a book can go through, and one of the things that can level up it more. I would say it's even more important for some aspect of the cover, even though the cover is the very first thing that a potential buyer, a potential customer, potential reader sees. But when you are preparing your book and you dedicate it to it so much of your time, and I'm talking about months, it could have been years, the editing is basically the thing that can make or break really your story. And we're going to talk about different kind of editing and level of editing. But broadly speaking, when we talk about editing of a book, we mean this. If we are not an editor by profession, we basically hand our manuscript. It can be at different stages to somebody else, which is a professional, which she or he does know what she or he is doing on that manuscript. Now, the way you see your story, it's might be interesting and brilliant on your side of the things, but you need to have another view of that manuscript, and that's where the editor comes into place. Now, what is that the editor does is taking a critic view over your manuscript, over all your story. If we're talking about fundamental editing, so if we're talking about just really make sure that your story kind of makes sense for somebody that is not you. So that's why you need that external eye on details. So the job of an editor is to make sure that your book, it's really up and it's really interesting for readers to read. This is the first kind of editing that you can decide your book needs to, the fundamental editing. There are other line of editing below, I would say. There is something that's called the line editing, copy editing, then there is a proofreading. Each of these, it's a different kind of service by itself. And I do know there are self-published authors that they ask for a fundamental editing, then they get the manuscript back, implement the changes that the editor gave, and then give it back to that same editor or another editor for a completely different editing. That can be the line editing, which is a more throughout a paragraph by paragraph, line by line kind of things. The proofreading is actually, I would say, maybe the very end of the process of the editing, when you polish things out, comma, semicolon, all that kind of stuff. So there are different levels of editing, and I can't, me myself, Michele Mitrani, possibly do this. And it's because one of the reasons is because English is my second language, and so there are so many things that I do not know of the grammar and of the things. But even if that was just a secondary reason why I would handle my manuscript to an editor, is not the only thing that covers it. Again, there are things that I don't see when I write my own book, and I'm sure that this is completely the same for any other authors. Things that I don't notice, things that make sense for me. That's why I give my book to an editor. And I'm curious to know more of your process, Krista, but basically what I do is when I finish the first draft and I read it once, maybe twice, what I usually do is I will give this rough, not polished manuscript to one or two test readers. So this is even before I give the manuscript to an editor, because I want to understand if the story makes sense overall. So I ask them, completely ignore grammar and structure and stuff. Does the story make you turn a page? And then when I get the feedback, I implement the feedback of the test readers, and then I rewrite the story, and then after that, I give it to an editor. What do you do?
Well, yes, I have a fairly involved process that I have developed over the course of the last sort of dozen stories. And I have found I don't use a lot of beta readers necessarily. So when you're saying you're looking at test readers, a lot of people would know that phrase as beta readers. So some people do that because it is a good way to kind of polish things up before you hand it over to an editor. And that developmental edit stage where they're giving story feedback is a really interesting part of the process. But a lot of people do that work not with a professional editor. A lot of people do have sort of readers who give them feedback on that stuff. For myself, because of the pace that I usually work at, which is when I'm in writing and publish mode, I tend to go pretty hard. And for me, I really wanted one consistent feedback source for developmental edits. So when I write, I actually underwrite a little bit. I'm putting that in air quotes for those of you who are listening. But if I know that I want my finished product to be 25,000 words or 30,000 words, I will target about 26 or 7,000 words if what I want is 30 in the end. If I think maybe a scene needs to be added here or maybe needs to be added there, I won't fill in both of those blanks and then take it away later in the editing process. I will actually just leave a space. And if I don't have like a clear vision of how that needs to go, and I will very rough draft, send it to my editor. And Amanda will say, okay, here's where it's working. Here's where I'm not sure about this character's development or motivations, or, you know, the always present, not enough conflict. It's sort of you really could just, as an editor, buy a stamp. And if you just like for yourself, if you buy a stamp that says not enough conflict, you could be your initial beta reader and you could just stamp every page of your work with not enough conflict. And that would save you certainly a certain amount of money on editing. But, you know, Amanda will go through it at the developmental stage and she'll say, okay, here's where I think we need more. I really wish we were a little bit longer in this scene, or a bit more here or a bit more there, or, you know, whatever kind of feedback she's going to give me. And then I will take that feedback and do a rewrite, at which time I will add in those extra words that were missing to get me to my target word count. And from an efficiency perspective, that just means you're not writing a whole bunch of stuff that you're then throwing away if it wasn't correct. And so I think that's one of the differences from when you're learning. It's really good to just keep, you know, write things out, like figure them out by writing them. And then you can cut away at stuff like making a sculpture, right? You're cutting away the bits you don't need. But when you've written a lot of books and it's in a process for you, it is nice to kind of underwrite a little bit and then just add where you need it to be added. It just saves a bit of time, a bit of effort. And then you're also not so attached. I have a really hard time cutting things out. Like once they're in there, I feel attached to them. So for me, it also saves me from killing a few more of my darlings, right? If I'm just producing them where they're needed, then that has value. So I bounce it to Amanda when I've got my first draft done. I bounce it to Amanda for developmental feedback. I go in, I do a rewrite of the story, and then I will work through it a few times on my own, actually. At that point, I will take a run through looking for consistency errors. So things like, does my character's hair change color partway through? Like, did I, you know, switch a character's name in the draft process? And often I'll make a switch and just keep writing and then go back and fill in the blanks. But sometimes you miss stuff. How does it work with my other books? Like, if there's another book that's tied to that one in the series at this point, I will often reread that other book to make sure that I don't have any contradictory details. I will look at the spreadsheets I have for my town and my people and everything else and just make sure that everything lines up. And then at that point, I generally will let my husband and my mom see it. And that sounds kind of funny, but they are actually my beta readers. My husband is also a writer. He's really good with plot and structure. And also some of my books have magic. And he's been big into the gaming world for most of his life. And so he's a really great world building game master. We call it the GM or DM if you're into Dungeons and Dragons. But he's able to tell me if I messed up the magic, or if there's, stuff that just doesn't make sense in the rules of the world, then he can identify that for me. And if there's issues with plot, again, and he does not read romance, which makes him a great feedback for that kind of thing, because you want to have a good story regardless of what genre you're in. And just because you can get away with some things in certain genres doesn't mean you should. So he's my story quality and magic detail reader. And then my mom is actually just really good with like worldly kind of details. And so things like, if my Christmas lights I'm describing them as strung around the power lines in a way that she's like, you just fried your town. Like, you can't do that. She's got a really interesting mixed background. She's good with construction and whatever. And again, like, she reads some romance, but she's not a diehard romance fan. So, but she does live in a small town, which happens to be startlingly similar to my fake small town. So she's able to highlight some things for me around that, or if there's an inconsistency with a character or whatever. She's got a good memory and she really pays attention to details. So she will point out, well, you said over here that this was the case. So yeah, it's not going to fly. So I'll make the changes that they suggest. And then once I'm feeling really good about it, I will send it back to Amanda for a full line edit or copy edit. So this is the kind of edit where you end up with like, I don't know, I think I have like 30,000 suggested changes in a 30,000 word manuscript, but it's just a line by line, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, adjusting phrasing or whatever, and giving really specific feedback at each of the stages. And
there is one thing, sorry if I interrupt you, like you are mentioning her name a lot, Amanda. So I was like just wondering, like, how did you choose her? Like, and
how did I choose her?
Yeah, I think this is important, like for people that are listening to us, like, okay, they're talking about editors. How do I choose mine? How do I choose a good one? Because from what you said, from your story, you're going back with her, like you trust her, like you really have developed this like connection. How did that happen? Like, did you add, because I'm a different phase, I do not have like an editor that I go back to every single time. I have to start from scratch. Right. And it will be very interesting for me, and I think for a lot of people, to understand how did you get to find her? What were the criteria that you were following? What made you realize that she was the one?
Well, it's interesting phrasing you use, that she's the one, and it is kind of like getting married a little bit. It is a relationship that you're going to have with somebody. It's like choosing an agent. If you're traditionally publishing, it's a relationship that you're going to have, and you're going to work really closely, and you have to really trust somebody. If you're willing to share like an unpolished draft of a book with someone, is kind of a gut-wrenching experience. It's you feel kind of naked and exposed and vulnerable. It is very it's nerve-wracking to let somebody in when you know it's not perfect, right? And you need to let them in before you think it's perfect, because you need to have that real feedback and stuff. So for me, it was just looking around in the networks I had, and Amanda and I are actually part of the same romance writers group. So I wanted somebody who was comfortable with romance, and I also knew she has a PhD in history. So there's a certain amount of nonfiction knowledge there as well, which for me, because I write in both genres, I wanted to develop a relationship with somebody that could potentially work on anything that I was working on. So that was a good fit. And then I asked her to give me an estimate of how much it would cost to do a story that I had ready. And I asked her to do a couple sample pages. And so I looked at the sample pages that she sent back, and I loved that she had put super funny little comments in the margins. So not everything was just a red mark that was like, oh, change this, fix that. There was also, she would identify if there was a part that really made her laugh out loud, or if there was a part that she really liked, or whatever. So she was sort of,
she went above and beyond.
To read. She went above and beyond, but also just personality wise, like the way somebody gives you feedback will make a difference of if you're comfortable taking that feedback or not. So just the way that she interacted, and the editorial letter that she wrote up for me that first time, it made me not hate the editing process. And so many people talk about how like their editor will send them their editing notes or their line edits, and they just don't even want to open the email because they just don't want to see what's in there. And it's, it's stressful when you've handed something to somebody and said, tear this apart, please. Like that is, it's scary a little bit, not gonna lie. But, I like that when I get edits back, I'm like, oh, I got edits. Okay. And then I can start reading and I see all the funny little comments and I see the suggestions, but they're all framed in a way that is like, okay, here's what you might want to think about for this and whatever. So she's not very like, you have to do this, this, and this. It's more like, okay, here's what I would think about. And then often I find the solutions are kind of buried in the language that she used to suggest something needed to be changed. So for us, it just works very well. And, yeah. And so then we just did another project and another project and another project. And now it's just really nice to have somebody who knows your work and knows your voice. And so once you've worked together a few times, you become much more efficient, because if you're sticking with the same person, they get to know you. You've built up like a style sheet for your book or your series. And so a lot of the questions that an editor needs to ask you to know how to edit your work, you don't have to do that every time. So it just kind of compresses that process.
So
as
basically, with this, like, we know and we understand how you choose her, why she was like a good fit for
well.
you. Why was a good fit for the kind of stories you write, for the kind of books you write, because you said like she's helping you in different kind of genre. Is that correct?
Yes.
Like the
Yeah.
romance and the nonfiction. But I think one question that is attached to that, and I think one is that is like kind of sensitive maybe, because like it requires us to give the audience numbers. It's okay that we found a good editor, but what is the way that we understand how much do we have to budget for the editing? Like, what does it cost? And I'm asking you this because I know you have more experience than me on that front, being having published more books. I do know by my experience that, for example, I commissioned the editing of 50,000, 47,000 words novel, and it costed around $500. I was very happy with the editing. I think it was a very professional kind of editing. But if somebody had to ask you, what does it cost? Is there even an answer to that? It depends so much from the words, the genre, the person that you're looking for. How would you answer that question yourself with the experience you have?
Yeah. So the only way to answer that question is to say it depends. But I can break down for you the things that it depends on, and that will help you to make those decisions for yourself. So I could take the same book and I could give it to 3 different editors and say, okay, what would it cost to edit this? And you could get estimates from like $200 to $20,000, depending
Wow.
on that person, right?
It
It's just
depends.
like anything. Yeah, it depends. And what it depends on is, as you said, like how ready is your manuscript to be edited? What type of editing are you asking for? Because if you just say, can you edit this for me? And you hand over a manuscript and they say, sure, it'll be $200. They're probably talking about a bit of a developmental edit, or just like an editorial letter where maybe they just read your story and they give you feedback on it.
Mm.
Maybe that person has never done editing before and they're giving you a super cheap estimate because they're trying to build their resume and they're trying to build up a portfolio of clients that they have as examples for future people who are interested in their work. So it depends where your editor is at in terms of their own experience, their own qualifications, because there isn't a standardized, like, it's not like saying I'm a doctor and there is a body who certifies you and an organization that gives you a license each year to practice. I mean, there are those, there are professional editorial associations, but not everybody belongs to them. And not all editors have been through the same certification programs. So one of the things to look for is, in fact, what qualifications does your editor have? And the level of qualifications they have will influence how much they charge. Another thing is, how fast are you asking them to turn it around? Because that's going to have a big impact on price as well. If you're saying, oh, you can fit this in anywhere you have a gap, that's different than I need this in 2 weeks. You need to bump all your other clients to fit me in, right? And so there's often like a rush fee or an additional charge if you are trying to sneak something in really quickly through the system. So that'll be one of the things. So the type of editing you want, that's one piece, right? Proofreading rates are different than developmental editing, which is different from copy editing. How experienced or credentialed your editor is will also make a difference. The quality of your writing, so how much polishing does it need, right? If you are asking for a copy edit, but you have already done like 3 passes and you've had beta readers look at it and you've run it through Pro Writing Aid beforehand and you've cleaned up literally everything you can, that's very different than handing somebody your first draft. So when we said we'd talk about the ways you can save money, this is one of those ways. If you get Grammarly or Pro Writing Aid and you practice running your work through it and you clean up everything you can, you did a whole bunch of the work for that editor, and the price you have to pay for your editing will be reflected in that. So I think that's a really important thing to remember as authors is every bit of energy you put into editing up and polishing your own work is money that you are saving on the editorial side, which is partly why I will get a developmental edit before I do any polishing on my work, because I don't want to spend a lot of hours polishing something that may not end up in the final book, right? It's very tempting to go back and just perfect and perfect and perfect everything, but it makes you extra resistant to removing it if your editor in the developmental stage says, I don't think this scene needs to be here. You're like, no, I
Well,
spent
I just put like
42 hours
3 weeks
removing.
on that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Then you are really resistant to kill that darling. And so you don't want to get attached in that way. You don't want to be so invested that you can't cut it out, right? So I think that's just really important to keep in mind, is that it's really smart to invest in your own sort of evolution as an author of how much of that self-editing you can do. And I think it's really interesting to work with something like Pro Writing Aid where you see each time. And I know that working with an editor over and over again on multiple books means that as I'm rereading it before I submit my new book to my editor, I will be thinking, oh, she's totally going to say XYZ about this section. I'll just fix that now. So, you actually start to
Save both of you some time.
yeah, you learn from the comments. And so working through those line by line edits, you will start to internalize the changes that you made from before. So you'll probably find the more books you do and the closer attention you pay to those edits as you make the changes, the least likely you are to actually do those same things again in the future. So yeah, that really doesn't answer it. How should you budget? You should take your basic information. You should say, okay, I have this kind of a project in this genre. It is this many words long. Here is a sample 3 pages. I would like a developmental edit or just a copy edit, or can you give me a price for all 3 types of editing if you do them all? Lots of editors don't do them all. And then you send them that request and they will send you an estimate. And you should ask multiple people for estimates just to make sure that you know what your options are and that you pick the one that fits your budget the best. And it might be that you have a dream editor you want to work with, but you can't quite afford them yet. So keep their business card on the side of your desk and go with the editor you can afford for right now. And then, get that product out there and have it start making money. And you can always switch down the road. Or if you absolutely want to work with that person, then you have a goal. You have a card with a number on it sitting beside your desk, and you know roughly how much money you need to save to be able to afford that editor for that project. And then you start tucking money away and you don't have that latte or whatever it is, and you stuff that money in your editing jar. I used to actually have a little tin when I served for years in the bar to make my tip money was what I put into my writing career. So I had an actual jar on my counter and I used to stuff my tip money. Anything over what I needed for like my basic household budget got to go in the writing and fun fund. So that I literally was stuffing a jar with money that was like, okay, well, I can pay for my next book printing when this jar gets to X amount or whatever it was.
you still have a jar, and we use it on a daily or weekly basis. So I'm just
Yeah.
telling you, I'm just
Yes.
saying that
Yes.
the jar thing, like it seems like very important. It's
Yes.
something that repeats itself. But like concerning the editing, there is a couple of things that you said very interesting. So the suggestion that you gave prior, it is very useful for people that have no idea how to find an editor. So you just said, if you read, don't know where to start, just send out to 3 or 4 different people um, a piece of your novel. See what kind of answers do you have. See what kind of specific feedback did you get from maybe a work tracking system. What kind of the voice of the editor. I think you can see that, and you can see personality through emails too. I can say this for experience. I had the pleasure, sometimes not so pleasurable experience of working with different kind of editors, and I could see like a person that was working or might have worked with me and my genre based on the kind of answer that I did get via email. So what you basically are saying is try different things, especially if you're at the beginning. Take some time to see what kind of editing those people gave you in those 2 to 3 or 4 pages that you gave to them, and then make an informed decision. If you don't have the luxury as an author like Crystal, for example, that already have like a partnership with another person, right? That really trusted somebody. You have to start from somewhere, and I think like the suggestion you gave, like look for different options when you're starting out is very, very, very important. And again, as you said, you might have already an editor that you really, really want to work with, but it's like a bit, out of your reach. Keep the business card on the side. There might be a time in which like you definitely can go confidently and be sure that you have the resources, you have the will, you have whatever you need to work with this person that it's been like in your dream kind of team all along. Now, we talked a bit about like the before phase of the editing, which is interesting both from the side of an author like yourself that already found the editor she works best, but also for people that do not have an editor and how to take the first steps to find one. But there are other things.
I'm going to break in here for a moment. I just want to add one thing. So
Yeah.
we kind of skipped over like, where can you actually go to find an editor? So there you can look up like the Editors Association of Canada, or there's different organizations that are editors associations around the world. So you can Google that. Personally, I think the best way to find an editor is to go into your writing communities and ask for recommendations. So if you belong to a local writers group or a critique club or something like that, great. If you don't, come join the Creative Academy. You can come on in there and you can post, hey, I'm looking for an editor, I'm in this genre, does anybody have any good personal recommendations? Because I think anybody can put up a nice looking website and answer a couple questions well, but it's really hard to tell what that experience is really like for somebody. But you should be able to always ask for references. It's just like any other contractor you would hire or any other job situation. You are hiring somebody to be on your team. And so asking for and checking references should be an expectation. They should be able to give you names for some other clients who have been happy with their work that they can connect you with so that you can ask questions. And then also, using some of these online forums. So there's loads of Facebook groups for writers, and there's loads of online groups for writers that you can access for free for the most part. So go in there and just ask and get those personal recommendations, because the best way to find somebody good is to find them through someone who has been happy with their services. And often you'll get recommendations of people who maybe don't have a website or don't widely advertise that they do this because they have a pretty decent client list already. Or maybe they're a retired librarian, and so they're doing this because it's also kind of fun for them. And so maybe that is the perfect fit for you at the stage of your career you're at. You don't have to have somebody with 14 letters after their name. They just have to be good at what they're doing. And so if that is going to be an opportunity for them and matches your budget, and it means you can get help with your book when you might not have been able to afford it yet, then you just have to pick the option that works the best for you.
Exactly. Yeah, there are several different options, and you should be able to find the one that works best for you, and just look outside your um, garden, I would say, and see and ask other people, people that you met, people that maybe know somebody that you don't know. So yeah, what Crystal just said is basically a word of mouth. Sometimes it's even more important that like a blog post somewhere, a website, maybe it's shiny, but you don't know that person. You don't know exactly where she or he is coming from. And the other thing that she said that is valuable is like ask for references, because like if you don't have anything to see and check or ask, it's not good. It's not a good indicator of maybe professionality or past experience that that person should have in order to take care of your manuscript.
And it's okay to work with somebody who's new, but that means that they need to give you a sample or something. Like you can, negotiate with them to kind of try it out and just make sure that that works. Some editors will do like a couple sample pages for free. Others will charge you, but it's still better to pay for a couple of sample pages to be edited and then make an informed choice than it is to just commit all of your dollars and your whole book editing process to somebody without kind of trying that on.
There was, I don't know if you have something else to say about this particular phase of the subject, but I had some other things more on the
Yeah.
after the editing. So once you have like a polished or polished enough, let's say like a piece of work, which is way ahead of your first draft manuscript or second draft manuscript, like what do you basically do with this kind of product that you have, which is not completely ready, but it can be used. For example, if you think of arch readers, so advanced review, giving advanced review copies, which don't have to be perfect, like on the grammar side. Like it's something that you use immediately as a resource to gather feedback and then potentially in the future reviews, or it's something that you keep for the very latest step. Like how do you use it?
So, okay. So the first steps were I send it to the editor. She does a developmental edit, sends it back. I rewrite it all. I get a couple of beta readers to read it. I send it back to the editor. She does a full line by line copy edit, and then she sends it back to me. At that point, I will sometimes let a couple people read it, but usually I do all the layouts and everything at that point. She will have done sometimes a proofread. I have an interesting relationship tools wise with my editor, and she has most of the same tools that I do. So sometimes we pass things back and forth in a format that you wouldn't normally use with your own editor. Like Amanda could open my Scrivener files or my Vellum files or whatever along the way, and often editors will only deal with a Word document. So it comes back to me. We do the polishing, the proofreading, and then I lay it all out. And then usually Amanda will take one more look at it to do like a final proofread once everything is in place. Because it's easy to muck things up when you're doing the layouts, right? Sometimes you change things, something gets deleted or added or just scrambled in the layout process. Vellum really reduces the risk of that, but it doesn't entirely omit it. So I will do the final proofread, make any last changes that she noticed, and then I have a review crew, I call them. So it's like an ARC team and beta readers kind of mashed up, but they don't see the book until it's really about to be published. So I will give my ARC team the book, and I usually have about 100 people on that team. And the assumption is they will catch anything that we didn't, because it does not matter how good your editor is or how good you are. you will miss stuff. There will be things that you didn't see. And we have kind of a game now, because I have a lot of retired librarians and teachers, and just really keen folks on grammar who are on my ARC team, and they are on a mission to find errors. And so it's very exciting if they find something that I need to correct. A certain amount of it comes back because I'm Canadian, my town is Canadian, I use Canadian spellings. I have giant warnings at the beginning of the books that say COLOUR is not a typo. That is how we spell color in Canada, because you are welcome here. So, we try to make that as clear as possible, but there are other words that kind of fit into that category. So I collect all the feedback from my ARC team and change anything I need to change before that book actually gets released on Amazon. So the idea is I will have it as polished as it can possibly be before that digital version goes out. I don't release the print versions until after the digital version has been out for a little while, because I want to correct any issues that come up in the digital version in those first couple weeks after release. So there's usually about a month of collecting feedback from readers, just if they find anything that we didn't. Sometimes it's a little consistency detail, oh, that kind of truck doesn't have that kind of seatbelt or whatever, and so then we fix all of that. And then once everything is totally polished and totally ready, then it can go to the audiobook production company as well. So the last thing I want to do is be fixing errors in an audiobook. So I do from the easiest to fix to the hardest to fix formats in a row, and at each stage get a little bit more feedback and make sure I correct anything that needs to be corrected, and then go on to the next phase.
That's how you polished basically the product, because ebook wise, super fast, 24 to 48 hours to re-upload it. Then paperback or cover, whatever it is that you use, and then audiobook, even because paying to do that, that's a lot of money.
Yeah. And most of my books are on version 10 to 12 before they hit the actual publication. That's how many cycles of revision they've been through before they get released. And even still, I have a couple family members who will be like, I found a typo. We have a lot of very type A, very detail-oriented people in our family, many writers, and so they are happy to point out what all of the rest of the world has missed.
Which you thank them
I do. I totally do, because I don't want any errors in my books. And so I know some people get very upset or take it very personally when readers point out that there are typos. But the way I think about it is, if they were willing to spend their time to document an issue, and they think you're the type of person who wants to fix it, that's why they're reaching out, because they think that quality matters to you, and they think your books are worth being the best books they can possibly be. So for me, I just think of it as they are generously willing to spend their time helping you make the best product that you can have. And so just say thank you. They just saved you heartache down the road of your next format of that book being incorrect, or a future reader maybe not sticking with your books when they would have, because that was one typo too many, or it just pushed the wrong button for them, right? I think you want to reduce resistance to your readers to keep reading, and typos are something that creates resistance. They're like little speed bumps, right? You can only take so many speed bumps before you're like, I'm getting off this road, none of this. So that's sort of the way I think about it, is just they're generously helping you keep people on your reading road.
So there is this thing. It happened actually a couple of weeks ago. One of my readers in Italy, she sent me a PDF filled with a couple of pages of typos and stuff and comments and stuff like that, that she found, and I was really grateful, because she was taking the time to do that for me. So I sent her back an email thanking her. So I think the approach you give and you have to these things, which are imperfection, and we are imperfect human beings, is completely fine. You should give yourself permission not to feel too bad when you see there is that thing that you worked so hard, and maybe you thought that there were no typos or nothing to fix, but actually there is. So it's important that you understand that it's just another part of the process, and the process is almost limitless because there's always going to be something that is not quite maybe the way um, it should be.
Yeah.
Again, you can't catch everything.
No, you can't. And I think maybe one useful tip to share is how I keep track of those things, because people send you notes here and there, but you need everything in one place. And I do dive into this. There's a section of the Strategic Series author book that actually talks about like how to manage feedback that comes in about your book. And one of the best ways to do it is have one place, whether it's an Evernote note or a Word document or whatever system you want to use, have one place that you collect up all of the feedback, and then you can see when stuff is coming in, do I already have a note of this or do I not? And you can do your updates in batches. So you don't want to be updating your book file like every day for the first couple of weeks as it comes out, one thing at a time, and then you don't remember, did I already change that or did I not? Just collect everything for the first couple of weeks, assuming they're minor issues to correct. I mean, if you've completely misnamed a character or like included something that's totally wrong, change it right now. But if it's just like a little typo here and there, just collect up a few of them for the first couple of weeks and then do a re-upload and correct everything at once, and keep that document. Just cross them off or highlight them in your Word document so that if somebody notices something later and sends you a message, you don't know if they're reading an older copy of that book or if they just downloaded it now. But if you can see, oh, I already corrected that on, April 7th or whatever, then you don't need to go back and hunt for it again, because you can spend a lot of time looking for errors that no longer exist. And it sounds silly, but if somebody downloads your Kindle book and they don't actually read it for 2 years, which has actually happened to me, they are going to see stuff that you have corrected a long time ago. And so you being able to see that and say, oh yeah, actually, I did correct that. You should be able to download an updated version of the book. But I always tell them, like, if you can't upload if you can't download a new version from Kindle, just fire me back an email and I'll give you the book funnel link. Sometimes I just send them a book funnel link automatically because I know they obviously got the book from somewhere already. So I'll just say, ooh, actually, I updated that, but here's a link. You can download a free copy that's the most up-to-date one so that you don't find any more errors in it. And that's just another, like, it takes you 1 minute to grab your book funnel link and send it to them. It doesn't cost you any money because you're already using the service, and it makes them feel very like excited and heard. And also that's some good customer service, that you were able to take the sort of a negative situation and turn it around in a positive way. And people remember that and they respond differently. And they feel valued as readers, which they are and should be. We don't have a career without our readers. So, we need to keep them at the center of the things.
They're always the hub, always the heart. We should be listening to them and at the same time learn from them every single time. Now, after all of these things that we said, do you think like people can get along without a professional editor?
There are definitely authors who do. There are a number of authors who I know don't have professional editors, and they publish a ton of books and they seem to sell a ton of books. I think it depends a little bit on who you're selling your books to and who your readers are. Certain categories of readers and certain subgenres of books are a little more forgiving than others. So, I mean, you have to know your audience. I think ideally everyone will have professionally polished books, but I know that isn't the reality. And especially when you're starting out, you just can't always afford it, and what you really need is to get your stories out into the marketplace to see how readers are responding. And so I think you can test that, but I would say if you're going to skip the professional editor, definitely spend the money on a tool, whether it is Pro Writing Aid or Grammarly. Make sure you make that investment, because you need something outside of you to help you polish that work. You cannot, your brain literally cannot see all the errors, because our brains are magical and they switch things to be what we expect them to be. And so that's why, even if you are a professional editor, you don't edit your own work. You can do the first couple passes, but you always need other eyes. When we were running our publishing company, our rule was a minimum of 12 people had to look at each book, and we would still be finding issues after 12 separate professionals looked at the book. So, we all see different things, and we all pick up on different things, and we all have different things that stick with us as far as grammar and language go. So I think, yes, potentially you could skip the professional editor, but if you're going to do that, make sure you take every step you can to be as polished as possible. And that means knowing your craft. That means also reading your reviews. If you publish a test book that has not been professionally edited, you better read every single comment people made. And that's where you're going to find out. If you have a bunch of bad reviews and comments about typos, then obviously you cannot build your career off of that kind of a reputation in the publishing world. So you need at that point to make some adjustments. But if you're getting really good reviews and nobody is commenting on typos and stuff, well, maybe you can get away with it. So it's going to really depend on your own language skills and your own comfort level with punctuation and grammar and everything else, and your own comfort level with the craft of writing. Because if you don't understand what makes a good story, people are not necessarily going to identify, well, you really, your climax came a little too late or too early in terms of your story structure, and you didn't have enough internal conflict. They're going to be like, that was boring. And they're going to stop reading at, chapter 2 or whatever it is. Or they're not going to get into the dialogue, or they're never going to connect with your characters. So I think, people will select out. And so you don't want to take that risk if you don't have to, I think. If you're choosing what to spend your pennies on, the cover, because if they don't buy the book in the first place, they'll never get to read it. So the cover and your editing are your two things to just not skimp on if you're choosing what to spend your money on, because you can always add ads later. You can always scale up how much money you're spending on promotion or what you're doing to promote the work. But if people don't buy and read the book, you can't scale that. There is no way to scale a bad story into success other than pulling it down, rewriting it, paying for the editor at that later date, and re-releasing it, which some people do, but that's such a lot of work. So personally, I would rather upfront focus on the cover and the editing and writing part, and then I can scale all the rest of it later. Yeah, that's just my opinion. Okay, so if you could go back to your prior self, let's say like the beginning of last year, right before you did your first in English publication, what advice would you give your past self about the editing process now to change things?
Well, I'll probably sit with myself. And make sure that he knows one thing that I did not quite know like a year ago. I would say 2019, when I started really focusing on the project of releasing the first English book, which is the way Anglo-Saxon people perceive stories. It's slightly different from Italians. This is why we have what's called, for example, European science fiction, which is slightly different from the American one. There are a few things that are different. I'm not going to go into details, but if there is this distinction, there is a reason. All of them are from the Western world. And this is something that maybe for you, Crystal, is different because like it's really like part of the Western world, Europe and the United States, Canada, Australia. But there is a difference. When I published my, for example, science fiction work in Italian, they were not meant for the Anglo-Saxon audience, if you will. Now, the moment I decided to write in English, what I was doing is transferring what I learned, what I did with my previous books in Italian into English, and that didn't necessarily work because you have to understand your audience, as you and we repeated more than once. I didn't do this at the beginning of the year. I only started really shifting my attention over how the audience on this part of the Atlantic thinks when I attended the conference, the Creative Inc. Festival, actually, which we were both there in Burnaby. So I, for the first time, was put into a situation where I would have to listen to authors like myself in my genre. They were sponsorizing their products or talking about storytelling things. And I realized there were some things that were fundamentally different from the way I was thinking. Tension, pacing, they're not completely different, but there are differences. The moment I finished listening to this 3 days conference, I really sat, but this was April or afterward. And I started rewriting the book that I was writing at that time, which turned out to be Lord of Time, and which previously was called Wicked Time. And again, the title before, even the title, if you think about that, is a misconception of what I thought wicked meant. And to make your story short, like wicked for me was like something just evil or not very good. But wicked also is featured as part of title in many romance books because there is the wicked love component. So when I try to release that Wicked Time as a short story, and this is funny, but I'm going to tell you the story. Many people believe that was an M and M romance, so male and male, because they will see like Alfred and Pacific. You saw like a very previous cover, which was completely different from mine. So that definitely came from my understanding and different culture kind of things. So to answer your question is, I will probably sit with Michele and really make sure that he understands that the books that he's writing now are different from the previous one, different from whatever he thought was good for the European or Italian market. So this is probably the most important thing that I would say if I had only time to speak with him, and tell him one thing: just know your audience better. Read more books of that genre. Exactly after the Creative Inc. Festival, I really started to read a lot of English books. And then I understand, oh, so that's what's tension. That's how this climate happens. And after reading books in general of English, I started reading books generally focused on science fiction, dark fantasy, and urban fantasy. This is really, really important for me, Crystal, because like it's not something you can learn from a book, a grammar book. This is something you learn just by osmosis, like just by reading other books that are similar to your genre, talking with other authors that publish or release books in your genre. There is no way you can learn this like in a book.
No, not in a book. But I do think this relates back to our conversation about editing, because that's part of an editor's job. If you have a good editor and they are giving you story feedback, they should understand the marketplace. So if you are somebody who's new to a certain genre or new to a certain country or market or whatever, then that is a very valuable role that an editor can play. So if you maybe are looking at a developmental edit, that's a good way to approach that. Is they can help you identify those things that you need to look at, and because you may not even be aware of what the differences are, right? When you're inside of it, you can't see it. And so that's a really valuable role for editors to play, is to draw your attention to market expectations. And usually an editor in your genre will have read hundreds, if not thousands, of books in your genre. And that's how they got into that in the first place. It's usually a love of that particular genre. So that is why also it's important to match up with an editor who has your same background in terms of your genre interest. Because if I had my romance book to an editor who only does epic fantasy, that all of the feedback they give me is going to be about how to make that book into an epic romantic fantasy, and that's not what I want. So you do need to make sure that you're just matching up in that way, for sure. And yes, we could never drill home too many times: know your market and your readers. As a strategic authorpreneur, which of course we all are, we are going to pay attention to all of those things. And because we are curious strategic authorpreneurs, it is time for the Curious Jar. And I stuffed a bunch more pages in it.
Wow.
More questions came in. We have a rainbow of colors here. I am going to do this. Tell me when to stop.
Now. Oh,
Okay.
oh,
Green one.
another green one.
All right. So, question is, what author or story made you want to be a writer?
Wow.
No pressure.
It's just one or it's several?
It just says one, but like
Mm,
if you have to branch out to a couple, maybe we can think about that being okay.
okay, I would say Isaac Asimov for the science fiction side. When I read the Foundation series, which is like 3 books and then became 7, um, when I read it, and this book has been published, I think 60, 70 years ago, like in 1950, 52, more or less like Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, I believe. I don't want to say stupid things, but I think they were not published in two different of context, temporal context. Isaac Asimov, because of the scale of the Foundation series and super short dive into what I'm talking about. Foundation series is basically Asimov took the idea out of the way the Roman Empire collapsed, and he made it on a galactic scale. So you will see this amazingly well-defined like universe and worlds with like thousands of worlds and the humankind that spread far and wide, and then you will see it like crumbled, and you will see like that just the beacon of civilization left, the foundations in this case, and you will really have this feeling of like collapse, a feeling of losing something important, culture in this case. So I would say Isaac Asimov really made me want to write something of that scale. Probably that's why I wrote my 4 books science fiction book series on Milagros in Italian. And fantasy wise, I would say Tolkien. um, but contrary of what some people might think, not necessarily the Lord of the Ring. Another work he wrote, which is called the Silmarillion, and the Silmarillion is basically something that precedes the Lord of the Ring. It's more like it's like the Jews, it's the poetry, it's what makes his works so complicated. It's the music between before the elves. It's really how everything got to be set up. So he will talk about the gods. He will talk how the god, there was like the good god, the bad god, how their power spawned over new beings, like how the singing of the things like made think out of nothing, how the elves were born, how the humans, dwarves. It's really like a genealogy, I would say. So it's really like the foundation of what a fantasy can be. And I was like, this is amazing. Like you reiterate that's basically what world building is at its best. I think like you get to play God, and that's something that Neil Gaiman also said. Like world building is generally, I believe, the moment in which an author in any genre you can think of, even like a romance, that's world building. When you build your own crystal like island, you get to play God. And I think the Silmarillion was really something that Tolkien inspired me, and that's one of the reasons why I like to create my own world, do my world building kind of things. I'm now curious to know what it will be for you, because like we
Uh,
write in so different genres. So
yeah. Well, and I guess I would have a hard time pinning down just one as well because there's a couple pieces that sort of fed into things. So the earliest one was maybe Anne of Green Gables because I loved Anne of Green Gables, and I actually got introduced to that through the CBC like series that was on TV when I was a kid, and I recorded it on the VCR because that was the current technology a billion and a half years ago. And I watched that over and over. But Anne wants to be a writer, and she's always making up these elaborate tales, and she's telling crazy stories about every creature, everything, and they're just she lives in this amazing world of imagination. And I was like, yeah, I can relate to that. Okay. And so I didn't really think about it in terms of being a writer as a career. That didn't really register. But I guess that and Little Women together. And Jo is always scribbling her stories, and that those two together from my childhood was kind of planting those early bugs. But the actual like romance writing as a career thing was definitely Nora Roberts, which is super predictable in the romance world. But I just happened to be born the year that her first book was published. And my entire life, she has been a consistent presence with new stories. And she's like the master of the trilogy and just fun mixtures of like witchcraft and Irish stuff and all of these interesting different careers that her characters have. And I think she just does such a brilliant job of integrating the details of that. Like there's a trilogy that is about like the Black Rose and the Red Lily, and there's 3 of them together, and Roz, one of the main characters, runs a flower shop. But the subtlety of the language and the way it's all blended in, everything is coherent in those stories. And so I think that's the mastery of it, is it's just so subtly in the background and it's accessible and people love it, and you just kind of get sucked in to the characters and the worlds and these mini linked books. And so I really liked the way that there were connections between the books, but they weren't all obvious series. And sometimes characters from another set like pop up as cameos in a different trilogy, and that were maybe written like 20 years apart, or maybe it's the kid of one of them. And so if you're not paying attention and you haven't read all of them, you'd never know that. But I really loved that. So that sense of like interlinked story worlds is really, for me, what kind of got me thinking about, how did I want to build my story world? And if I were going to write for, 40 years like she has to date, like if that's what I was working towards, how did I want to make that happen? And so she's definitely been, as a person, also as the writer person, an inspiration, as well as I just love to read her stories. So that's an interesting mixture on both sides. It's like, okay, women can be writers. This is a thing you can do. You can have it as a career. As long as you're willing to work your butt off for like your entire life, then it is achievable. And since I'm not scared of hard work or long-term commitment, I'm like, hey, I'm in. So since I was, 14, I've been like, yeah, I want to be her when I grow up. So we'll see. It's good to have goals, right?
I think you are on the right road for sure.
Yeah, well, I don't own a castle or an island yet, but one day. Or a mountain. Sorry, a castle and a mountain. I don't know if she owns an island or not. But she definitely lives the ultimate writer's life. That is for sure. So we would like to hear your answers to the curious question of the week. So I'm going to put it up here for a second. What author or story made you want to be a writer? Drop that into the comments on the page under the show notes. And if you have a Curious Jar question, please email it to ideas@strategicauthorpreneur.com and we'll add it to the mix. Now, for show notes, links to resources we mentioned, and coupons and discounts on tools we love, you can visit us at strategicauthorpreneur.com. If you subscribe to the newsletter, each week we will email you just one thing that will help you along your writing and publishing journey, and a link to our latest episode of the Strategic Authorpreneur podcast.
And you'll get a gold star and 1 million bonus points in the game of life if you leave a review for us wherever you listen to this podcast.
Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy life to get to know us, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on our next episode, where we'll take a deep dive into the publishing side of being an authorpreneur. That's true. I'll have to start recording sooner so that we can put,
all the behind the scene
things. Mm-hmm. Yeah. True story. Okay, so editing things.
And you can hear me correctly and fine with the amazing.
Yes, indeed. All right. Shall we do this thing?
Let's do this.
Okay. Hey there.
Amazing. That's done. Finito.
Finito. Yes. It sounds way cooler in Italian.